Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Welcome to our session 7, the second part and final part of the chapter of Noah. This is proceeding quite well, exceeding my expectation. I hope it is the same for you, and you've been keeping on top of your readings, and as well as the zikrs that seem to provide a real opening, a real fat, at least for myself, in this reading of the Fusus al-Hikam. I'll start with the reading. It's not much, and then we'll just proceed straight into the questions and have a lively discussion before leaving this chapter to begin the next chapter for the following week. Okay, so there's about 8 people here now. I don't see anybody waiting in the waiting room, so everybody's here. Good. Okay, so Noah in his wisdom said to them, his people, he causes the heaven to rain upon you copiously, meaning intellectual knowledge and reflection, and has provided you with reserves of wealth by which he reserves you to himself. When he does this, you will see your form in him. Whoever imagines that he sees the reality himself has no gnosis. He has gnosis who knows that it is only his own essential self that he sees. Thus are the folk of God divided into those who know and those who do not know. And his offspring, meaning that which results from their ordinary discursive thinking or opinion, nazar is the word that's used, while what is required is the devotion of knowledge to contemplation, far removed from the fruits of ordinary thought. Now, this is an important point. If you recall, the issue of the offspring and the fruit thereof was broached at the very final part of the chapter of Seth. And before people, jump to certain conclusions regarding whether Ibn Arabi is making a literal prophecy, in this chapter, in this particular part, he has glossed the meaning of what offspring means in relation to the people who are incapable of producing it. At the end of the chapter of Seth. To go on, it will only increase them in loss, and their commerce will not profit them, meaning that which they had within their grasp and which they imagined to be theirs departed from them. In respect of Muhammad's heirs, al-Muhammadin, he says, make use of that over which you have been appointed as regents. In the case of Noah and his people, he says, have you not taken a trustee other than me? This is a very subtle but very important point, because with the al-Muhammadin, the heirs of Muhammad, which here is talking about the Sufis, he means that they act in the capacity of the regents or vicegerents of God towards creation. Whereas the difference with the people of Noah is, what Ibn Arabi is saying is that, God is saying that you only keep me as your trustee and I do whatever I want with creation myself, through whom I will. Whereas with the al-Muhammadin, Ibn Arabi is asserting that the situation is one of the face of God towards creation, whereas with the people of Noah, it is the face of creation towards its God. So in essence, Ibn Arabi is actually emphasizing a very subtle but important point that because this is about the transcendence and immanence dialectic, that the al-Muhammadin, the heirs of Muhammad, in a sense, represent the instantiation of immanence to the world in their own multiple forms, whereas the people of Noah, because because they have saturated themselves with the false immanence, are being told to turn towards the transcendence and to the face of God in the transcendent. It's a very, very interesting point, and it can be unpacked a lot. By this, God confirms that in their case, the power was theirs, meaning the heirs of Muhammad, God being trustee over them, while in the case, or rather, let me read that again. By this, he confirms that in their case, the people of Noah, the power was theirs, God being trustee for them, while in the case of the heirs of Muhammad, they are God's regents in his kingdom, God being both the possessor and the trustee, while they are possessors only in the sense that they are regents. Very interesting point. Thus, the reality is ruler of the kingdom, Malik al-Mulk. Some other manuscripts have it phrased differently. They phrase it as
Huh?
mulk al-mulk.
Okay.
Okay, can somebody throw? Yeah. Please shut your microphone. Thus, the reality is the ruler of the kingdom, as indicated by al-Tirmidhi. And this is where it gets really interesting. Ibn Arabi's interpretation of these verses from the Surah An-Nur. And they hatched a great conspiracy, meaning that summoning to God in one mode is, in a sense, a deception played on the one summoned. Since God is no more non-existent in the first mode, that of the one summoned, than in the second. I call to God, which is deception itself with clear vision, indicating that both modes belong to it. Thus, they, for their part, responded to him with a deception as he had summoned them with one. What Ibn Arabi is saying, essentially, and this is a very controversial point, that to call to God, right, or to call on behalf of God, in one sense, is a deception. Why? Because God exists as much in the summoning as much as the summon. So, in another way of saying that God exists as much in the negation of its mode as it does in the affirmation of its mode, right? And I've recently written something that I will publish maybe in a month or two, where I say essentially the same thing, that in one particular modality, the situation of a believer and unbeliever is identically the same. However, the difference is between the believer and unbeliever from this perspective is that the believer is latching on to a particular modality in a very constricted sense of understanding the nature of the divine, whereas the believer, due to the fact that the believer has faith that God can do anything at any time, whatever it wants, it attempts to not circumscribe God to that particular modality of the disbeliever. But from another angle, the believer and the disbeliever from that ontological level are identical, are equal, even. And this is, in a different way, I am saying what Ibn Arabi is essentially saying here. He says, the hair of Muhammad knows that the summons of God is not a summons to his abseity, the essence, the dhat, but to him in respect of his names, asma, the modes. He says, on the day when we will gather together the guarding ones in a band, indicating that they will come before God in the all-embracing name of the merciful, ar-Rahman, not before God in his essence. We know that the cosmos is under the rule of a divine name that makes all in it guarded. This is the name al-Rahman, which together with the name Allah as the all-comprehensive name, Ibn Arabi also takes as another instantiation of the all-comprehensive name. So Allah and Ar-Rahman are the two all-comprehensive names of God. In their deceptions, they say, do not abandon your gods, neither Wad, Suwa, Yaqut, nor Ya'uq, nor Nasr. If they had abandoned them, they would have become ignorant of the reality to the extent that they deserted them. For in every object of worship, there is a reflection of the reality, whether it be recognized or not. In the case of Muhammad's hairs, al-Muhammadin, he says, your Lord has decreed that you serve only him, meaning he has determined it. The one who knows who is worshipped and in what form he is manifest to be worshipped. He also knows that the distinction and multiplicity of forms are merely like parts of a sensible form or the powers of a spiritual image. Indeed, in every object of worship, it is in truth God who is worshipped, because God's presence is in everything. We cannot assert a vacuum in the presence of God without getting into some very serious logical, metaphysical contradictions. In the case of Muhammad's hairs, okay, the ignorant man imagines the object to be invested with divinity, and were it not for such a notion, neither the stone nor anything similar would be an object of worship. For this reason, he says, bid them name them, meaning that the objects of stone and wood. Had they done so, they would have called them stones, trees, or stars. Had they been asked whom they worship, they would have said a god and not God or Allah or the God. The man or woman endowed with knowledge does not imagine thus, but knows that the object of worship is the vehicle of divine manifestation worthy of reverence, while not restricting him or herself to that particular object or form. The ignorant man says, we only worship them that they might bring us nearer to God. The man of knowledge says, your God is only one. So submit yourselves to it, howsoever he is manifest, and bring glad tidings to those who conceal. That is, who conceal the fire of their lowly nature. They would say a God and not a nature, something passive. He also says they have caused confusion to many, meaning that they have caused them to become perplexed in the face of the apparent multiplicity of the one in respect of its aspects and attributions. So now Ibn Arabi is taking these verses of condemnation against the kuffar, the unbelievers, and applying it to the state of the progress of the Sufis on the path to annihilation in God. It only increases the oppressors in confusion, meaning those who oppress themselves by self-denial, who inherit the book of unitary knowledge. These are the first of the three categories described by God elsewhere, since he places the self-oppressor before the moderate one and the doer of good works, which is true, it's very interesting. In the Quran, in these particular verses, it's the kuffar and the zalimin come first and mentioned before their opposites. In confusion, that is, in spiritually self-effacement, perplexity on the part of the heirs of Muhammad, the al-Muhammadin, who said, my Lord, increase my perplexity concerning you. When the self-revelation of the one, shines from them, they proceed. But when it shines not, because of the multiplicity of forms, they stop in perplexity. He who experiences this perplexity is ceaselessly centered on the pole, God, while he who follows the long path to a distant God, an utterly transcendent God, is always turning aside from the supreme goal to search after that which is eternally within him, running after imagination as his goal of fantasy. He has an imaginary starting point and what he supposes it to be, a goal and what lies between them, while for the God-centered human, there is no restriction of beginning or end, possessing as he does the most comprehensive existence and being the recipient of the divine truths and realities. In other words, stop running after something outside of yourself or even in your mind. Stop attributing this transcendence that you can never actually reach, because then it makes a complete mockery of any kind of suluk towards that. And then what would be the point of religion and faith and all of this stuff? Because of their transgressions, going beyond themselves so that they drowned in the seas of the knowledge of God, which is what is meant by perplexity. And they were cast into the fire, which means the same as drowning according to the hairs. When the seas swell, where the same verbal root, sajarat, is used to denote the heating of an oven. So there's a verse in the Quran, the verses that he's quoting, but which instances the surging waves of the oceans, and this is the same word that's used, sajarat, to describe the flames of a fire, or the flames of heating oven. Nor will they find any helper apart from God, since their helpers are in essence nothing other than God, and they are annihilated in it forever. Were it to deliver them from the seas of gnosis unto the shores of nature, he would be lowering them from an eminent stage of spiritual attainment. That is relatively eminent, although in truth all is God's, through God indeed is God. Noah said, "O my Lord." He did not say, "Oh my God," because God as the Lord is fixed, whereas the divinity is manifold according to the variety of his names, and every day it is engaged in some matter. God as the Lord denotes a constancy of mode without which that he would not be appropriate. O my Lord, Rabbi, do not leave any of the deniers dwelling upon the earth. This is where Noah is cursing his people. That is on the level of devotion to formal manifestation, to beseeching that they be brought to the inner aspect of the knowledge of essential unity, the Tawheed. In respect of Muhammad's hairs, it might be said, if you left down a rope, it would fall upon God, he being below and above. This is a hadith. And his is what is in the heavens and the earth. When you are buried in it, you will be in it, and it will be your covering. To it we will return you, and from it we will bring you forth a second time, because of the variety of aspects. Of the deniers who seek to cover themselves in their clothes and put their fingers into their ears, seeking cover because he summoned them that he might shield or forgive them, which is a kind of covering. Dwelling, that is, any of them at all, so that the benefit might be general as well as the summons. If you spare them, that is, leave them as they are, they will confuse your servants, meaning that they will perplex them and cause them to depart from their servanthood, from their ubudiyah, to assert the mysteries of lordship, rububiyah, in themselves, so that they will consider themselves as lords after being servants. They will indeed be servants, become as lords. They will only bring forth, meaning they will only produce and make manifest one who breaks open, i.e. the wrongdoer, that is one who makes manifest what is hidden, the one who denies, that is one who conceals what is manifest after its manifestation. They will bring forth what is hidden and then conceal it after its manifestation, so that the beholder will be perplexed, not knowing what the discloser intends by his action, nor the concealer by his, though they are in truth the same. My Lord, shield or forgive me, that is, conceal me from my separate self and cover for my sake other than you, and render my relative span and station unknowable in you, since you are without measure. You say they do not assess God to the fullness of his measure. Ma qadarullah haqqa qadruhu. And my parents, from whom I derive, meaning namely the intellect and nature. And whoever enters my house, that is, into my heart, believing, that is, confirming the divine communications, having himself received them. And the believers, both men meaning the intellects and women meaning the souls. And do not increase the oppressors, those in darkness who belong to the unseen, concealed behind dark veils, except in destruction, meaning fana. That is, their annihilation in God. They have consciousness of themselves because their contemplation of the face of the reality absorbs them to the exclusion of their separative selves. Among the hairs is remembered the verse, all perishes save his face. Kullu shayin halaka illa wajhahu. The destruction, the halaka, in the above verse meaning this perishing. Whoever wishes to gain access to the Noah mysteries must ascend to the sphere of the sun. And in the manuscripts and in all the published texts, rather than nu, it is spelled out as you instead. These matters are also dealt with in our book, the Musul Revelations, At-Tanazzulat al-Musaliyah. Okay, this is the end of our chapter of Noah. I hope you managed to follow some of these extreme exegetical paradoxes that Ibn Arabi keeps throwing right and left in this particular chapter, reading into some of these verses the opposite of their outward meaning. But it's absolutely beautiful the way that he does this exegesis. It is so controversial, this way that he has interpreted this verse, these verses in the Surah of Noah, that the modern commentator of Ibn Arabi, who claims to have finished the Fusus al-Hikam, the late Hassanzada al-Mudi, of Iranian cleric, refuses to continue explaining these in his own commentary on the Fusus al-Hikam. It's quite hilarious actually. But I've gotten a lot out of this modality in the way that Ibn Arabi interprets verses, because it shows a creativity on the part of reading these verses, which is quite heartening, because you don't see this in the exoteric tafsir traditions. But in with such esoteric, it's not even tafsir. This is outright ta'wil, which usually Ibn Arabi or eisegesis, esoteric interpretation, which usually Ibn Arabi at least outwardly claims that he doesn't engage with, because ta'wil is usually the mark of the Batanis, the Ismailis and others. And Ibn Arabi, as a purported Sunni, was a bit against this way of approaching things. But that here, in this chapter of Noah, in the latter part of it, in these interpretations of these verses from that surah, this is essentially exactly what Ibn Arabi himself is doing. Anyway, I've gotten a lot out of this for years. So now's the time for our questions. I open the floor, whoever wants to start. Anybody?
Maybe here it is so filled with symbolic interpretation. We can just start one by one commenting on all of them. The chapter is not very long.
No.
Okay. In such case, here what is meant, Noah summoned his people by night, and in that he appealed to their intellects and spirits, which are unseen. This is on the one side, and by day in the that he appealed to the evidence of their external senses on the other side, but he didn't unite the two. What is meant that
this is great. This is great. This is from last week, but what Ibn Arabi means with this is this: the difference between Muhammad and Noah is that Noah, right, appeals to esotericists as esotericists. So he approaches the batin from the batin, and the zahir from the zahir, without uniting the two. Whereas what Ibn Arabi is saying regarding Muhammad, that he called to his people by the day in the night, and in the night by the day, is that the esoteric and the esoteric are simultaneous with the message of Muhammad, according to Ibn Arabi. So that that Islam, at least in the way that Ibn Arabi is presenting his interpretation of the revelation, is that there's a simultaneity in the esoteric and the exoteric, without there being an opposition between the two. Whereas with the people of Noah, there was an opposition. So, and he's suggesting that Noah may have made a mistake in doing that. That's not for Allah. I mean, this is a valid interpretation of this chapter and the whole story of Noah in general. That that the reason why they didn't come to his summons is because he was not uniting the esoteric and the exoteric together at the same time. And he's making distinction, addressing the esoteric as the esoteric and the exoteric as the exoteric, without joining the two things. And this is what caused the rejection of his call. Whereas what he's asserting, that in the Quran and with Muhammad, peace be upon him, the opposite happened, where you had both of these happening simultaneously. And those who have ears and eyes to see then can distinguish what is what in that situation. But in the Quran, it's very interesting, despite the literalism of some people, it's very surprising that when you have certain verses and chapters, there's always the refrain going through these verses, Yadrabullah al-amthal, God is striking parables, or God is striking similitudes. It says this over and over and over and over and over again throughout the Quran, yet certain people take these verses literally when the Quran itself is saying not to. That these possess realities beyond what the outward expression is saying. And so with what is being suggested with this particular tidbit here in this chapter is that it is important for any revelation to have these two things combined as a simultaneity. Number one, because of the differences in the consciences of the various audiences being addressed, and number two is then that it unites in that simultaneity the inner and the outer, right? Which ultimately, from the point of view of God, there is none. There is no inner or outer. Even though these names exist, there is no inner or outer. But if you merely address one to the exclusion of other and vice versa, then in a sense you are imposing a limitation on your own message. Okay, and so what Ibn Arabi is suggesting is that with the Quran and Islam, this has been averted for that precise reason to the people, so that the people who had the istidad, who had the predisposition to understand the esoteric within the expression of the esoteric got it, and vice versa. And those who had the inclination to the exoteric, by virtue of the expression of the exoteric, then were able to grasp the esoteric as well, right? And this in itself then becomes a mercy, which then brings people into that divine reality immediately.
So just in the introduction to the chapter, when at least what is this, I feel that when it is said that the people who put the stress only on the transcendence are wrong, and those only on the immanence also wrong, and those who combine the two, they got the essence. But it is pointing the Nuh alayhi salam got just the transcendent part. The people of
No.
Nuh
He's not
only
saying
the
that.
immanent.
No. Wait. Ibn Arabi is not suggesting that Nuh didn't understand this. What Ibn Arabi is suggesting that Nuh expressed it this way to his people, not that he didn't understand it, right? Because what that section we just read is very unequivocally asserting that Nuh did understand. Nuh as a prophet had the esoteric dimension in his grasp. The problem, as far as Ibn Arabi sees, is the modality of the expression that Noah brought to his people, in that it was because of their inclination in only worshiping God in a totally immanent form, in effigies and idols, etc., that he determined that it was incumbent for him to push the tanzi, the transcendence, above the immanence, to get them to move away from this imbalance, as it were. But Ibn Arabi is saying that this approach itself was laden with problems, and this is the reason why these people rejected Noah, because he was not prepared to acknowledge, to them at least, although he understood it himself, that yes, the presence of universal divinity inhabits these idols by virtue of being a created thing, right? That it has the divine imprint in it, because everything has it. So they rejected him based on that, because he was being discriminating. You understand? So then what Ibn Arabi is positing is that this whole situation between Noah and his people then constitutes a form of deception, makr, because he knows that the divine presence is in the idols, right? They already take these idols as having an inhabitant divine present within it. So then what should Noah push this transcendence argument to them above everything else? So that then this whole situation is one of deception on both sides. It's just basically quibbling over his specific point of view. But he goes on to kind of qualify that, because then it's imputing imperfection to the Insanic common in the form of Noah. In that, yes, although this is, from one perspective, this is what's happening, and it's kind of a deception, yet nevertheless, a man of knowledge understands that, you can't say that the totality of the divine presence is only concentrated in these various effigies and what you're imbuing sacrality to, and so that way we say one. So if we then accept this axiom, right, we can have a simultaneity here as well by first asserting, yeah, sure, your effigies, your idols, etc., are imbued with the sacred and a divine presence by virtue of being created by that ultimate presence. But by the same token, it's everywhere else and it's beyond at the same time, right? Now, I find it, this is what Ibn Arabi is saying, but when we go back to these ancient civilizations itself, and as now is beginning to be understood by archaeology and research and studies, is that actually these so-called pagan people, and the word pagan itself is a problem, which Algiz Uzdavini's spent a lot of pages explaining, is because, for example, the ancient Egyptians, even the Sumero-Babylonians, Assyrians, etc., didn't have simplistic notions of these deities. These deities were symbolizations of forces. That, yes, they anthropomorphized them, in the way that they did, first of all, as a form of ornamentation for their artwork and their architecture, etc. But when we go back to what these people actually understood about the nature of the divine and the sacred, it was quite a sophisticated thing. They were not as dumbasses as many people think they were, especially as the Old Testament and the Abrahamic tradition seem to project upon this. How could they be civilizations that erected such amazing art, architecture and art and etc.? How can they be simplistic? If they're sophisticated on this level, surely they're also sophisticated in their understanding of the bigger picture. In a sense, one can only also impute that Ibn Arabi himself had understood this axiom about 800 years ago, and that he's trying to express this in the environment that he's in, that is, saturated with very straight-jacketed exoteric mentalities, who have a projection of history that is extremely narrow-minded, and it's coming from a very literal reading of the Quran or even the Bible. So when we take this on board in what Ibn Arabi is saying, he is, on the one hand, it appears that he's trying to appease everybody, but on the other hand, his argument is extremely sophisticated, and what he's saying is correct. And it's also the understanding of pretty much all of antique Neoplatonism. What Ibn Arabi says here may as well have been said by someone like Iamblichus or Proclus, or even coming straight out of the Corpus Hermeticum. But he's articulating it in a very specifically Islamic, Abrahamic context and subtext. And this is what makes it amazing, to read him, to see what he does with the Quran. And, it's just mind-blowing. Like I've said, I've only seen one other person in the whole history of Islam with the ability to do something like this with these verses, to read them in such a radical fashion. That is the Bab. I haven't seen it in anybody else, to this degree of novelty, that Ibn Arabi offers it. Anybody else? Come on, people. Questions?
Me?
Yeah, oh, sorry, you can go ahead.
Oh, I can wait. Yeah. You go ahead, it's
Oh.
fine.
Okay.
Sure, okay. I guess I just wanted to I guess a clarification on a few quick things. I know it's
Sure.
something that you've already addressed, but essentially what he's saying is that in the whole wise man, ignorant man distinction,
Yes.
he's essentially saying that this whole idea of idol worship is essentially it's an intellectual problem and not really a
Yes.
God's
Ooh.
taking offense to whatever you're doing.
Exactly. That's what he's saying. He is, if he were to articulate it in today's state, this is exactly what he would say. That idol worship, idolatry, is basically an intellectual problem and not an ontological one. So, yeah, that's a great way of putting it. So this is what the problem can be reduced to, because ontologically, the idol itself, inhabits the universal ocean of being, which is God and the divine presence. So, it is only from that intellectual standpoint where you're imbuing that idol with a specificity and then negating everything else other than it, where this becomes a serious issue. But conversely, in our own time, we can say exactly the same thing about exoteric religious form, and Islam in its exoteric form especially. That the way that Muslims imbue their modality of worship, right, is the same form of idolatry that's being criticized about the people of Noah or any other people in the Quran itself. It is a form of shirk because it's excluding something else. Okay? And that means that then every item of Islamic dogma is potentially, right, can potentially be turned into an object of idolatry and become shirk. And that then becomes an intellectual problem. Ontologically, it is what it is, but intellectually, it is problematic.
Yeah, and I think it's fundamentally it is the issue with our limited ability to understand, well, at least at a like a normal level. Like I'm sure there's some people as Ibn Arabi like lost earlier in the book, but the ability to understand that multiplicity in like a full sense, because you kind of like it's natural for us in our particular viewpoint to like fixate on something, and then the issue with that that's not the whole picture. And of course, we naturally want some stability. We don't want, I guess, if you don't have that higher level of gnosis, you just want something stable, something that's reliable.
Yeah.
And that's where people love tradition and, the old ways and, those kind of things. But
this is something the Quran itself then addresses regarding the people of Abraham, right? When Abraham invites his father to Tawheed, the father responds by saying, we're worshiping as our forefathers have worshipped. Why do you want to change the modality of the worship of our forefathers? So then that becomes the same excuse as the people of Abraham, and it's this is the irony that even the Quran is addressing itself to all peoples by saying that, if you fix yourself into a modality of worship and understanding about the divine presence, you are essentially committing shirk. And then it goes on later in the Quran and say, every day it is upon some new task. So dynamism is the nature of the Godhead. That is what it is. And for a Gnostic to taste that, they must, at least from a starting intellectual point, accept this as an axiom in order to then later on experience it for itself. But if you freeze God in a very particular modality of worship, then you have committed shirk. Even if it be Islam and you're paying obeisance to the concept of Tawheed and unity and all the rest. So this is also
definitely,
this is what Ibn Arabi is trying to convey in a very subtle way.
Yeah, I think that's definitely like the kernel I'm getting of the controversy of this, because it kind of like it leaves you with like, not only of course it undermines the traditional narrative like a lot, and I mean that particularly in this sense because of the the fixate, like Tawheed especially is something that's really, really like in their sense it's just not something that comprehends the entirety of creation, but maybe it's very myopic and limited. And I think it's something that has to do basically with the fact that the whole experience of Islam as an empire, like how it became an empire, became very exclusionary and insular, like just like every other imperial
to add insult to injury, now that you're finding in a lot of critical historical scholarship about early Islam, is that almost everything that is taken as dogma today was a fabrication of the Abbasid period. That whether we're talking about the canon of Hadith on both sides, Sunni and Shia, this was all codified during the first, couple of dynasties, a couple of kings and caliphs of the Abbasids. So before this time, Islam was extremely fluid. And I did when I did that podcast last year with the Gnostic Quran channel, I kind of tried to broach this. Like, for example, the Codex of Ibn Manzum, one of the early Quran codices that we know about. And this was from the early Umayyad period codex of the Quran, excluded Al-Fatiha, the first chapter of the Quran, from the Quran, because Ibn Manzum claimed that this was a prayer and not a revelation. And so if it is a prayer, it's being offered by the prophet and it's not being sent down from Gabriel through God, or through Gabriel from God to Muhammad. and that there were differences in verses and etc. This is not even entering into discussion about the 7 ahruf, the 7 forms of voweling and reading the Quran itself that changes the meaning of these verses sometimes very radically from reading to reading. Then, like, for example, with the Shia and 12 are the Imamis, particularly, we're now beginning to learn through very meticulous study by people like Moezi and Jambé, and late Wilfred Madelung, etc., that, basically what happens towards the beginning of the period of what the Imamis called the Greater Occultation, that there was a consensus formed amongst the elite of these people as to certain elements of the doctrine that now today are taken as being immutable, divinely willed realities. That this was not the case at all. And so that there was a lot of exclusion happening of certain points of view within the Imami community, thus pushing a lot of these people into the embrace of whether the Qullat or the Ismailis outright. And then, we haven't even discussed the Ismailis and their various approaches to these questions, the various groupings of Ismaili between the Qarmatiya and the groups that went on to form the Fatimid dynasty in Egypt, and then the various splits that happened in that between, the Tayyibis and the Musta'ilians and Nizaris, etc., etc., etc. So, even though Ibn Arabi is coming at all of these questions from a very elevated, vertical point of view, there is a historicity to a lot of what he's suggesting as well at the same time. Because the Islam of Muhammad and the early Muslims, as we're beginning to see now and has been known about through various sources for over 1,000 years now, was very different. It was something completely different. And through what sociologists of religion now call the routinization of charisma, in the Abbasid period in particular, the face of the Islam that we know today formed as a form of consensus, and as a form of controlling a particular dogma and directing it into a very preconceived kind of idea about what it should be. And this also includes, as certain scholarship is beginning to suggest, notions that are sacred cows, such as Khatamiyya, the seal of the Prophet Muhammad. There's a lot of scholarship coming out that is showing that this idea in itself was not understood in the first few centuries of Islam as meaning a termination or an end to anything. That this particular meaning to it was superimposed in the Abbasid period. So then prior to this, and you should probably go and look at the introduction by Eaton Coburg and Muhammad Amir Moezi to Revelation and Falsification. This is a text that was edited. It's an early Imami reading of the Quran, talking about the falsification of the Quran, where this particular text offers alternative readings of certain parts of the Quranic ayah. It's not a complete of Sayyari. It's a very, very interesting text. And it's probably evidence of text that came before it. We also see these very variant interpretations and reading of Quranic ayat in some of the very earliest of Imami Shia tafsir, like Ayashi's tafsir of the Quran, etc. So these issues are all up into question, but Ibn Arabi obviously came from a very established Orthodox Sunni milieu. And even if he had stumbled on these truths, which I believe he had, there was only so much that he could openly express in writing without having a massive backlash happen. I mean, he would write poetry and these mullahs, these fuqaha would react against him and pass a fatwa of takfir against him, let alone if he mentioned anything like this. But in texts like the Fusus al-Hikam, and also spread out throughout his Futuhat al-Makkiyah, he often has these angles on certain issues of sacred cows of Islam that just stun the Orthodox. And this is why they don't like him. And this is why someone like Ibn Taymiyyah, Lanatullah alayhi, he just lambasts, Ibn Arabi in a very psychotic way throughout all of his writings.
Yeah, I did.
What he does is
actually.
G's. It's G. I mean, what Ibn Arabi does, in my opinion, is utter genius because he is following very meticulously and carefully the orthodox subtext and context to the fault, right? So that no one can overtly accuse them of heresy. But then, as the argument proceeds, then he begins to show his intention and his interpretations that just shatter, anything anybody holds as being orthodox in any conceivable sense of that word.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that last statement. I think that's the highest level I think of what we would call like taqiyya, deception. Just to go back to another thing that's part of this chapter, it's because you have to have all your orthodox bona fides and like show that, and then you can play with that, and so that's something very interesting. I do have other questions, but I know other people wanted to go, so and it's not really strictly related to the last one, so I'll just turn it over to someone else.
Okay, all right, Vanessa.
Thanks. Before I ask my question, I've got another question based on what you just said. If you could quickly address that.
Sure.
That is, if you could explain the difference between the seal and the termination of the prophets.
Well, we have the verse that, Muhammad is not the father of any of you, but is the seal of the prophets. Khataman Nabi'in is the way that it's phrased in the Quran. The seal, in the conventional Orthodox way that this particular verse is interpreted, is they suggest that it means that it is the end of all revelation. So Muhammad is the last figure, prophetic figure in all history to ever be sent by heaven, right? And that word khatam, in the way that it is interpreted by the Orthodox Muslims, it means that this verse is saying that it is the end. It is a khatam, it is a seal, it is the end, termination of that particular function. Whereas, as I was suggesting earlier, the word khatam itself has a very polyvalent meaning. And as contemporary scholarship and suggestions in earlier sources had it, the early Muslims did not understand that word in that sense at all. In fact, they understood this as something else entirely, where a khatam basically means a seal in the sense not of a termination, but as a kind of a validation. So when Muhammad says, I am not the father of any of you, but the seal of prophets, he is basically saying that I am basically the seal of every prophet that has gone before me, right? That I validate all of them as being true, because all of them, in a sense, their revelation is contained in my revelation, and I am the seal to that, right? Rather than in a very either or binary kind of way saying, well, that's it. I'm it. No more. Goodbye. Business closed. You're on your own now. That's not what it's saying. According to more earlier, more refined and polyvalent understandings of this concept of seal. This is a very controversial thing because it is the basis of what we understand today as being Islamic orthodoxy. To deny the sealhood in the sense of termination of Muhammad's prophethood is essentially to be a heretic, a zindiq. But as we're finding out, and as common sense itself would demonstrate, to take that notion in that kind of a way itself creates a litany of problems. Number one, theodicy. This whole concept of the end makes a mockery of any form of theodicy, that God is constantly intervening positively to rectify evil and imbalance in the world. And it's also a logical contradiction, because if something terminates and then there's an interval between that termination and what is to come at the conclusion of this termination, then this makes this creates a picture of an extremely linear and very dumb kind of trajectory of history. Whereas experience and our understanding of history shows that history is a very dynamic and circular way of moving, that there is no such thing as from point to point Z or Z, that it is constant. There's circles within circles, circular, concentric circles within circles. And all of that is following a single point at every time, such that everything is simultaneously both a beginning and an end, with that beginning and end always being God at all times, right? So then this makes the notion of sealhood in the way that fundamentalists and Orthodox Muslims understand it a very dumb way of looking at this question. But it's one of the biggest sacred cows of Islamic Orthodoxy. To question it is to question Islam to them.
Well, isn't it question? I mean, doesn't it come down to fairly categorically whether there'd be another prophet or not? Versus a prophet versus revelations.
But what if? But see, this is what, for example, a lot of botanies and especially the Bayan have asserted. God is not even bound to the letter of its own revelation. God can do whatever it wants, and if you question that, then you're questioning both the omniscience and omnipotence of God, which is then a problematic notion in its own right. So if God wanted to create, this is what Mirza Muhammad Ghalib once suggested in one of his poems that just drew the ire of these Orthodox clergy in the subcontinent. If God wanted to, it could at any time create another Muhammad.
Mm-hmm.
At any time. I mean, who are we to say no? He can't.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the Quran says this in relation to the Jews in their denial of Jesus. They think that they can bind the hand of God. Cursed be they for such a suggestion. Their own hands are tied. God is dispensing its revelation all the time. So if the Quran is saying this in a particular context, how can this not then be applicable in all contexts at the same time? We will get to this because he brings this up later elsewhere in the Fusus al-Hikam, and in the Futwad, he brings it up like a dozen different times, and it doesn't and answers it in a dozen different ways. But these are the sorts of issues that I think a kind of a straight-laced, or for another way of putting it, a straight-jacketed believer needs to deal with, right? You can't just basically partition your head and say everything is kufr. This is what we believe. This is the way it is, and that's it. Everybody else, walakum dinakum waliya din. Do you be your religion to be mine? Ibn Arabi is saying thui to all of this. Both notions are simultaneously true and also false simultaneously at the same time. The real truth being the Al-High itself.
That makes sense.
In every context, yeah.
Thank you. So it seems like there's an element of people being designed to want to be in the box, like with all the rules and the dogma and the gods, right? And the anthropomorphism. And my understanding of one of the main benefits of people getting out of that box and not having all their individual gods would be that it reduces factionalism, so increases obviously unity. When they're in the box. When they get out of it. Sorry. Yeah. So when the Tawheed, it reduces the my God, your God, tribalism kind of stuff.
Yeah, Tawheed. However, in the way that Ibn Arabi is presenting, and not in the way that, say, the Salafists or the mullahs, etc., and the fundamentalists are presenting. Yeah, in the way
right, because it. Yeah. Because it seems like inevitably people have that inclination to get back in the box.
Yeah.
And what you can see that at certain scale, once it starts sort of growing, that there's inevitable factionalism. And you can see that the bigger something gets and the longer established it's been, the more offshoots.
So then it becomes a ridiculous argument between people in boxes. My box is better than your box.
Exactly. And it then made me think about, say, Hinduism, where you see that people are allowed to have the box, they're allowed to have all the gods. Yeah. And it seems the more enlightened they become, more complex, the more they just find their way to Tawheed anyway. Because when you look at what the sort of most advanced sort of yogis that I've, some of the ones I've read, they sound like Muslims in the way that they talk. So the question is, what is the, I still find it limiting. Like I try to be, this is one of the things I have around when I go to people who are doing Hindu things, like, especially like around the Byron Bay area. I get like I get angry because I feel like I'm at a at a pantomime. It feels like it feels silly, and I want to really try and respect that this is just the manifestation, right, and the inclination that people have, because maybe some people can more successfully interface with something more literal, but then so why should we get rid of that? And obviously there's a social advantage, the intellectual advantage that someone else mentioned, that it's obviously so much more expansive. And then you have maybe interception by beings that start demanding that you sacrifice things to me, and they could corrupt those channels that people believe they're communicating with the God or something, and then something else comes in and can maybe take over. So
from my point of view, having been around these people and their types for decades, a lot of these sorts of types of people, especially in the Byron crowd particularly, there's a lot of self-deception at work. It's not gnosis, it's outright self-deception. And there's also an echo chamber, because certain people believe a certain paradigm of things, then it gets echoed by others in another form, rather than that being the individual gnosis of those people. That's something else entirely, because from the bigger picture, all of these forms that are manifesting, whether of the jinn or demons, etc., are also simultaneously manifestations of God of one of the names. So if a real Gnostic will take it in that sense and just dismiss it, or just see it for what it is and move on. But in those sorts of New Age sorts of communities, where you're talking about Byron Bay or whether you're talking about Sedona, there are not paradoxes at work. There are oftentimes a lot of contradictions at work, where people are talking the talk of spirituality in the context of UFOlogy, or in the context of kind of an extraterrestrial form of anti-Semitism of the kind that some of these conspiracy theorists present. It's a very warped metaphysics. There's no real ontology involved to any of this stuff. And then by the same token, you have people who are, on the one hand, saying everything is one, right? But they're only lashed on to the light and don't realize that the oneness also inhabits the darkness, and the tree casts its shadow, as it were. So this is the sort of situation. Plus, you add into the mix a lot of drugs that these communities are usually engaging without then any further reflection or integration of whatever insights they're getting in this state, and it's just it's a powder keg,
Sure.
I made some very good friends in that Byron Shire community back in the zeros. Some of them were extremely good, deep people, and they were really, really sincere about seeking real knowledge. But then there were other people who were not. There were real flakes, and since that time, you've learned that these people have given up that hippie lifestyle altogether and have gone into the proverbial Wall Street, because that hippie lifestyle didn't work for them, which says that that was only a trend, and nothing else, nothing further for them. This sort of path, if one follows it sincerely, is a difficult path, because fundamentally you yourself are your greatest veil and enemy throughout it. So you're basically refining yourself at every moment. This is what Ibn Arabi is constantly hammering here, where he says that we cannot behold the essence or the totality of things. That is impossible and is obvious. However, what you behold is ultimately yourself, right? As that refined manifestation of the immutable archetypal essence that is in the mind of God, that uniqueness that is in the mind of God, that is you, that this is what you need to grasp. Thus, why in the community of the Gnostics, small g, there are those who know and those who don't know. Those who are still running after some kind of a mirage about what the ultimate is, versus those who keep coming back to themselves for that ultimate knowledge. So it's very interesting that what happens where we have a sort of condemnation of immanence happening in this chapter, while simultaneously a praise of it in another context of the same chapter. Because the transcendentalist, right, in a Gnostic path, like Sufism, right, if they're a strict transcendentalist, they never attain anything. But the immanentist, who seeks the God within themselves, and then also realizes that that God within themselves is transparent to the totality because it is a reflection of it, right, is closer. And so there is then their path then doesn't have that limitation, that kind of linear limitation. It is nonlinear. And the point of the compass is always with them everywhere, wherever they go, such that then he says there's no first or last involved in the path that they're following, because they're in that presence within themselves. They carry it. You know, they are being annihilated in the face of God within themselves at every second moment, whether they're conscious of it or not. And that becomes their wayfare from themselves to themselves. Ibn Farid, contemporary of Ibn Arabi, has a very, very beautiful poem at the tail end of his the great poem of the way, where he says, I was a prophet sent to myself from myself, and it is by my own signs that I was guided to myself. So in substance, I would say that with kind of a community like we find in Sedona or Byron Bay, etc., without kind of pushing the psychologization of people, if some were to approach this kind of high esoteric spirituality as a psychologist, or appropriated contemporary psychological language and then presented it to that community in such fashion, I think probably a lot of the people in that area would start to gravitate towards this message. And then over time, slowly but surely, these very silly kind of things that kind of accrete around these sorts of communities would kind of fall by the wayside after a while. And so then people would really be traveling away. And this could be articulated via Hinduism and Vedanta. It could be articulated in any way, through Islam, through Christianity, through any religion for that matter.
Yes, and that's the thing, is that I recognize that the same wisdom is there in Hinduism, and I'm speaking specifically about white people doing Hinduism in that area of my experience, right? Because I find myself to feel very hypocritical that I'm believing myself to be this spiritual person and Muslim, but then I'm allowing myself to be irritated by the anthropomorphism, and so then I'm not really what am I then if I can't accept it?
I would do this if I were there, is that very slowly and subtly start to break those false idols, very subtly and deliberately start to break those idols. First acknowledge them, as Ibn Arabi is suggesting in this chapter, but then by acknowledging them, find a way to then shatter them at the same time.
And it's interesting.
Try to make these understand is that the form of idolatry that they're grasping to in this very new agey, silly approach to the question of divinity is transparent. That it's just a project. It's just one form amongst infinite.
And the funny thing is, they will say that. People will say, "Oh, yeah, we know that ultimately it's not really real in the objective sense. It's not really a form in reality as such. It's just a representation of something that is an essence, right? So it's an immanence of a transcendence."
Which is what exactly the people.
And I'm like, but why bother?
Yeah.
But maybe that is how the mind deals with it. Except though, when you look at Islam or something like Zen Buddhism, it doesn't have to be in the box.
No.
Even though people try and find their way back into the box with the rules and the dogma and stuff.
Well, this is the thing. This is the human condition, is that it constantly wants to put itself in a box. It's comfortable. It's just like people who crawl into bed and don't want to climb out of it anymore to go to work. We like the box. We like this womb. We don't want to get out of it. We don't want to stretch out. But this is not the path of a true seeker. If everything has its place, a time for sleep, a time for boxing yourself, and a time to get out of the box and stretch out, right? And in a sense, you can articulate it this way. You try to tell them that in your various asanas of yoga, you don't merely have one form of the cat pose or the cobra or whatnot. You're in your asanas, you're constantly moving back and forth. So why don't you look at the bigger picture and the objects that you're worshiping from this point of view at the same time? I mean, if you're looking at the asanas as physical postures, then try to project these physical postures into metaphysical realities at the same time. Maybe you'll get enlightened in the middle of doing your morning yoga before your coffee.
Well, ultimately, it seems like my focus should be on whether it makes the person a better person and more merciful to others. I'm having an intellectual snobbery around it, and I don't like that.
That's something that then you have to kind of curtail and police in yourself.
Yeah.
But if you see that there is bullshit, right, then I think in a sense it is your duty to all high heads, you put you in that position as a sort of contemporary Noah amongst these Byronistas. To sort of kind of cut them to size a little bit, but you do it in a very gentle and intelligent kind of way to challenge their ignorance and try to push them and prod them gently along into kind of opening their conceptual toolbox about things, that maybe there's a bigger picture behind all of this. That sure that it is ultimately a subjective representation, but there is also a trap in worshiping the subjectivity, because God occurs in both that subjectivity and objectivity, right? And then you can then maybe get into personal discussions with these people about what is making them then to latch on to this sort of approach. And more often than not, there's a personal reason for it, without fail, And so then you maybe help them along in resolving that personal issue. And once that personal issue emotionally is resolved, then their conceptual toolbox about metaphysics becomes more open to bigger concepts.
Well, I find people are very receptive to the concepts. Yeah, if you can, and also lead by example in seeming happy with what you've got. It's the best. Yeah, but it's just all the stereotypes around Islam and its inaccessibility.
Well, that's. I mean, I found that back in the zeros, and this was just right after the period of 9/11, and there were some really good people who were extremely interested, and they wanted to know more, and they invited me a couple of times to Byron especially, to give talks about Sufism. And then you had your people who had that typical colonial settler knee-jerk reaction at the same time. For them, that is the way. But you can continue by having these sorts of discussions and kind of convey to them in a kind of an indirect kind of way that your fear and paranoia and Islamophobia is a projection of your own self, that there's a bigger picture here that you're not seeing, just as you're not seeing the bigger picture again about God itself. You're also not seeing the bigger picture about what the reality of Islam is. And if you approach it from that, then these people kind of lighten up after a while. I mean, it worked for me. I mean, I left, so there was there wasn't anybody that I'm aware of that was able to kind of convey these sorts of things to those folks. In any way, I mean, some of these people found me very intense at times. That was more because of my personality and because I'm a no nonsense kind of person. But when you sat down and talked to these people and let them get into your head and you simultaneously got into their head, more often than not, you would come to a common ground pretty quickly.
Sure.
Yeah. Zachariah, you had another question.
Yeah, so I just wanted to, I guess, get your opinion on the last. I know you're somebody very well acquainted with the works of Ibn Arabi. That last statement about when he refers to the futuhat, like what is there, like can you just give us? I know you don't have to go in depth, but what exactly that references in terms of the like when he talks about the sphere of the sun, I was kind of like unsure about
That's
what
not
that
in the
is.
Futuhat al-Makkiyah, that's in the Tanazzalat al-Mawsaliyah. He has an extensive discussion of that. The text of this Tanazzalat al-Mawsaliyah exists in the Hyderabad, the Arabic text. In the Hyderabad edition of the Rasail ibn Arabi, there is a translation of it. I think that Pablo Benito made. You can actually find this online as a PDF, I believe. I'll look for it and upload it to the Telegram list. But yeah, I mean, he has a more extensive discussion about Noah, but it's more in the context of mystical astrology in that particular text, which is quite an interesting discussion. Let me see if I can find that translation. If it's online, I'll upload it to the Telegram during the week.
Okay, thanks. And I guess like the just before that, I also wanted to get your thoughts on the his gloss on that do not increase the oppressors, those in darkness. Like what did he mean by that? Specifically, I guess he's talking about the annihilation
Yes.
of death. I'm sure. So like, is that his sort of his, I guess, his interpretation of like
Yeah,
punishment? Yeah.
yeah, it only equals oppressors and confusion, and by the Zalimin, he's not taking it in the sense of oppressors as in bad people. He's taking it as in the darkened one, because elsewhere in the chapter he kind of then changes that tune. So this means that he's referring to the Sufis, especially those of them who engage in extreme self-mortification of their bodies, to attain these various states and stations and higher states of consciousness, etc. Which is, on the face of it, if one picks up the Quran and just follows the narrative of that story of Noah, it's totally counterintuitive interpretation of that verses. But he's applying it in this particular context. It's absolutely beautiful what he's doing. So what he's saying, that all these condemnatory verses and these verses that are trying to create these polar distinctions amongst the people of Noah doesn't really apply to them at all. It's actually talking about the Sufis. So he's interpreting it from that sense. He's then bringing it to an immediacy about a particular group of people in his own time.
Yeah, so I guess that does jump off into another discussion about the whole asceticism versus a sort of hedonism, or like antinomianism, like that sort of dynamic that's runs through Sufism. So I guess he's kind of like transcending that, and like I guess
he is essentially trying to tell us that both of these extremes are traps, one or the other. That there needs to be a balance. He says this everywhere, and it's also the Quran says this. The Ummat al-Wasat, the people of the middle, that you're not one extreme or the other, that unite these two and just keep both of them in a very moderate level. But with a Sufi, at least in the initial stages of their path, usually with most of these approaches, serious disengagement from the mores of both physical and social life become a demand at the very initial stages of the path. I mean, I did this also myself, where I would lock myself away, for days and sometimes weeks on end, or not eat certain things or not do certain things for certain. And this is all supposed to teach you, and it's supposed to condition you from the social and also biological conditioning of your life, to then open up your mind to a higher reality that otherwise may be absent, to basically get you to go back to your fitra, which the Quran mentions.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think
what Jesus suggests when he says, "Be like children."
Yeah, I guess thematically, it's like you detach yourself so that you can like break whatever previous kind of a rut or like conditioning that you have, and then you can go back and forth. It's not like putting yourself completely in one world or the other. So
once you break the habits for a certain period of time, right, you have broken the chain of the habit. Okay, once that chain of that habit breaks, even if the habit returns in another way, you are no longer a servant to the chain of the habit, right? So, because there's a recognition that in the life of the material world, you know, however far we go in our realizations of things, there are certain requirements that the body and the mind and everything else has. You can't, if you push it too much into extreme, you die. Very obviously. But if you don't do it at all, or if you then engage in the opposite, then you are also veiling yourself and, you know, potentially unleashing, you know, chains of causality that have very deleterious effects, side effects. So this is what, in a sense, is meant by being the people of the middle, because once you attain that middle ground, you know, just like that very famous Quranic verse and ayah says, you know, Bima ala rabbikum tukaththiban, which of the bounties of your Lord will ye deny? You know, everything has been created by you know, the existentiator of the universe, also for the enjoyment as well as the benefit of each of members of its creation. So to deny something, in a sense, from a bigger picture, is also to deny the progenitor and the creator of that thing, right? But there are also simultaneously balances in things that need to be observed. So if you go too much into one direction or another direction, it causes this imbalance. You see this in the world of religion, but simultaneously you witness this in the world, in the secular modernist world, where, you know, they've basically kicked all values out of the picture. So both of these are extremes, and there needs to be a middle ground. And the Arif, and then Arif Billah, the Gnostic in God, is the one who seeks to then bring the balance between these two extremes and unite them. And this is interesting that Ibn Arabi, you know, in this particular chapter of Nuh, he talks about this problem of one or the other, immanence or transcendence, and then ends up in this particular discussion about the Sufis themselves, suggesting that the same sorts of issues exist in that same context within the Sufi world, and then is subtly suggesting what the resolution to this is to be right in the middle of this. Engage in your self-mortification, all of this, but then come back into grounding.
I think because this is something that runs through the entire stream of like all of this kind of philosophical metaphysical thought. You know, we talked last week about the Neoplatonists who had like people like Plotinus, who's like anti-world, like to the extreme. You know, you should just like try and detach yourself. Yeah.
Not
Plotinus,
really, the Neoplatonists are not like the Gnostics were very world denying. The Neoplatonists, they have a world, they don't have a world denial. And their concept of evil is very, very different to the Gnostics, because what the Plotinus or what the Enneads suggest about evil is that what Plotinus calls tolma. And tolma basically suggests that as the one emanates the world, the more these emanations spread out and descend into the world, there's more of a coagulation, as it were, at these energies. And this is the kind of a fallenness of that energy from its point of origin. And so from a perspective, this becomes like kind of evil. But it's not, it is not evil in itself. It is not, you know, it's just, it is what it is, until that energy completely dissipates, which is what they hold the acme of matter to be, dissipation, or what Ibn Arabi would call adamiyah, non-existence.
Yeah, but I think, but he also, like, I mean, he saw matter, like, and fundamentally, that's like the kind of conflict between him and religion, is that he saw matter as being something like deficient, like it's empty, like instead of something that's.
What he uses, the concept of Tolma suggests privation. It doesn't suggest, so it's privated, okay? It is not in that sense that you're suggesting. What means is that it doesn't possess within itself the fullness of the pleroma in its totality, which is, you know, obvious. But in itself, it is neutral simultaneously. The Gnostics are suggesting this, what you said.
Yeah, I know they're the Valentinians and the Sethians, like that whole like feel, and like it's like, but it's like part of one spectrum essentially,
Yeah.
in terms of like, you know, the spirit versus matter, and like kind of going extremes in one or the other direction. And that's, you see that in Islam, Christianity, different like
All of them, yeah.
uh yeah, and all these different sects. So yeah, it's interesting. Trying to, I guess he's trying to walk that line. It gives you a lot to think about in terms of like how it's possible to keep the line in your own life, because it's very easy to
Yeah.
fall into one or the other because it becomes comfortable for you.
By the same, by the same token, you know, an arif has a duty to constantly break their own habits. So if they fall into a pattern of habit, they have a duty to break that. Because that habituation is what is the process of boxing yourself. This is, which is, you know, very standard psychology at the same time. So then this is the meaning for Ibn Arabi, at least throughout most of the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, of kharaqa adat, you know, breaking the habits, or which otherwise gets translated as miracle working.
And I think that's definitely something that I mean, it'll be something that you're struggling with your whole life, because you even see, again, people who are very well, you know, very learned, they kind of fall into their own. And it's like, I guess that's part of, you know, it's part of the aspect of creation, is just confronting yourself through others, because other people can point that out, and it's hard for you to do it yourself and keep yourself accountable. That's very difficult.
If we go back to the chapter of Adam and to the first paragraph, in a sense, Ibn Arabi suggesting this very thing about God itself, that the whole dramaturgy of creation, of God's desire to see itself as other in this locus of manifestation, the mirror of existence in Adam. This is exactly the same thing. So, yeah, Bruce Lee has this extremely wonderful line in his Tao of Jeet Kune Do. You know, to know yourself is to know yourself in action with others. And this is a very beautiful quote, and may as well come out of something Ibn Arabi says. So yeah, and so the Arif on the path, whenever they catch themselves falling into these various patterns of habituation, even in isolating themselves from the world, then they're duty bound to break that habit and walk. You know, I've fallen into these traps myself, even as recently as late last year and early this year. And my very good, wonderful friend Habib Shahbazi brought me out of it very quickly. And this is the thing, you know, that when you get on a path like this and you find and you attract people like that to yourself, then you keep them in check, they keep you in check, and God keeps you all in check. So you don't fall into these, you know, these limiting patterns, etc.
Thank you so much. That definitely is like more like on the praxis end. It's good that we address those kind of things and not just, you know, the actual philosophical side of the book. But I'll turn, if anybody else has any questions, I'll turn it over to them.
One of my goals is to, you know, in a sense, bring this stuff down to earth. These sorts of perspectives need to have an application in the lives of people. They need to be transformative. I mean, it's great, this whole philosophical excursus and the tradition around it, and the, you know, high-flying terminology and people, you know, splitting hairs and all of that kind of stuff. But on one level, and I think this is what Ibn Arabi himself suggests throughout his writings, is that this stuff needs to be transformative. It needs to affect your life. You need to be able to take it into your own life and then take it out of your life and give it to others. If that doesn't happen, then forget it. You find something that does exactly that thing. So yeah, sure, we can go into the philosophical excursus, but the philosophical excursus needs to have both an imminent application, both a transcendental contemplation as well as an imminent application simultaneously. As above, so below. Anybody else? We got to go. We're going way over an hour.
How do you differentiate between an aversion to a practice or something you've been doing just because you're lazy versus that it's become stagnant and that you're actually needing something else?
I established a rule for myself about a decade or two ago when I got into that particular pattern that you're trying to point out. For example, with a given zikr, if I'm reciting a given name or a dua too much, after a certain period of time, I realize that, I need to do something else, or to put it another way, that the energy of these particular names have done their thing, and now it's time to put them aside and pick something up. And almost immediately, when I get into that state of mind, something else does come up, right? Okay, so like then, I've been reciting the name Allah for 2 weeks. Now I should recite the name, Ya Rahman for another 2 weeks. And then as you continue to do this, after a while, it itself begins to, so I mean, the laziness and all of that stuff is always present. And then that becomes a kind of a challenging of yourself to get out of that habit of laziness, to box yourself into comfort. But with the actual practice itself, when you practice something a lot, after a while, especially when you're attuned to the practice and you kind of formulate for yourself a kind of conscious interaction with the practice, where your practice is communicating with you, as it were, then you kind of begin to glean that after a while about when to use a particular name or a particular dua or a particular form of the salat, and when to put it aside because it's not working for you. But by the same token, and this is something that my own sheikh told me almost immediately when I first met him, is that knowledge doesn't just come in expansion. Knowledge also comes in contraction. So you can have a state of bast, and all kinds of revelations are coming to you. But by the same token, that is a person who is walking the path, who is also then able to internalize in a state of contraction the revelations and the insight and inspirations that they've received in their state of expansion. So these two processes, the dynamism between openness and closeness, needs to also be taken aboard. So if you, for example, you've been doing a practice for a couple of years, and you just nothing's happening for me at the moment, then restructure your practice, add something else to it, spice it up a little. Just like you don't sit at home, eat the same meal every night, do the same thing with your practice. One night have spaghetti, another night have kebabs, another night after that have shrimp, whatever.
Is it halal shrimp?
Yeah, I'll shrimp if you want. Sure.
Thank you. Thank you.
Anybody else?
One more question from me, Saidi. In relation to what have been said, that God is not even bound by the word of his revelation. But in this sense, then then what is exactly the function of a revelation, and how are we supposed to interact with it? For example, let's say with the Quran.
That is a profoundly important question. Profoundly important question. The point of everything is the hidden treasure seeking to know itself in every conceivable form of manifestation. So when a revelation occurs in the form of the Quran, or even from my point of view, in the form of the Bayan, then it is incumbent for the true seeker and the wafer to engage very actively with this text as the logos, and allow the text to take them within themselves. So one of the things I have talked about with some of my own people is that we can get to, there is a stage where you have a fana experience with the book, right? That you so internalize the word, the logos, the kalima of the book, that it starts to occur to you in your dreams, in your outward waking state. You start to behold the narratives of the Quran on both their literal and their subtle and esoteric meanings all around you in your waking and your sleeping state, right? When you are at that point, then the literal aspect of the exoteric revelation transforms into something quite amazing, right? And out of that, anything can come out. Literally anything can come out. So at that point, you're just basically moving further and further and further and further and further, ever further into the depths of the reality, the Hakika. And that is depthless. It doesn't have an end forever. It's just, that's the point. So one thing that the Bayan argues very openly, which is suggested in other scriptures, but Bayan puts it very openly, is that the purpose of every collective revelation of the Godhead is basically to take the segment of those people who say Bala Shahatna, to the yes, we testify to the appearance of their Lord in that particular form, is to then go into the depths of what their Lord wants to show them of that reality. So that should be the attitude about interacting with that revelation for that time. And that is also then an argument as to why we cannot say that, a revelation is the end of everything. Because the depths of reality are endless, are infinite. If you say otherwise, you're limiting God. You're limiting the reality. And that in itself makes you a kafir in every conceivable sense of that, and a mushrik. The reality of God is infinite and endless. This is also why Ibn Arabi, in my opinion, is so important, because one thing he suggests that is very good as compared to some of the other Sufis, and especially in a lot of the other traditions, even Arabi does not believe in one-time only fana and baga experience. He says that this process is infinite, that you are just going from stage to stage to stage to stage to stage and experiencing annihilation and subsistence. Then, you keep going and higher, and you have annihilation and subsistence, and that manzel, and on. And this process doesn't end in this world or the next. It's infinite. So, for what it's worth, all those various masters or traditions who talk about, this one-time enlightenment experience, and the guru then gets worshipped as the enlightened being, in my opinion, and from the perspective of Ibn Arabi, this is a kind of silly perspective. Because there is no one-time only awakening. There are awakenings upon awakenings, and endless. So if you take the Bayanic point of view that posits these endless qiyamats in terrestrial time, then there are also these endless enlightenment experiences that are occurring simultaneously as well within that, so that there is no end to what can be realized. And that is the purpose of the revelation, in my opinion.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Folks, we really got to go. Start this next chapter of I believe it is chapter of chapter of the wisdom of holiness in the word of Enoch, with the zikr of Yaqudus, holy, and we'll also, as well, this will be a two-part chapter that we'll be studying. And there's some very interesting insights in here as well, but it's not, some of them are not as radical as the one that he just proposed in the chapter of Noah. And until we meet again next week. Okay, everybody be well. Ya Allah.